This first chapter is to kind of outline or go over some key concepts that you'll utilize through this whole book. Remember that going along with this is the first lab for this class, and that is some anatomical positioning and terminology. If you understand what we're talking about in the book with this and put it together with the first lab, that gives you the basis for this A&P class and also the second A&P class. So it's real important to get this first chapter down and that first lab understood. So let's talk about the basics. Anatomy is the actual structures that we're going to look at. And anatomy just doesn't have to be one thing. It can be a group of things. It is tangible. It can be really big, like gross anatomy, like your entire body at once. It could be microscopic, things you can't see with the naked eye, like a cell. Physiology is how does it work? Why does it work? So they work together. Everything has a purpose in the body. And once we get through this, you'll see that you can start figuring out why something is going wrong. There's an important principle, the principle of complementarity of structure and function. Basically, all that means is structure dictates function. So your heart is designed the way it is because it must accomplish pumping blood. If we were to change the heart in any manner, structurally, it's not going to function in the same manner. So anatomy is studied in many different ways, and we're going to actually talk about all the different ways as we go through these two courses. The first way is regional anatomy. That's where we actually break down the body into different regions. It could be 6 regions, 9 regions, or 4 regions, just depending on who you're dealing with. And that way you can say, I have right upper quadrant issues, I have lower quadrant issues, and that kind of gives a definitive area where the problem might be, and therefore you can investigate further. The second way we study anatomy is systemic anatomy. That's where we talk about body systems as a whole and all the organs or tissues that are associated with it. For example, cardiovascular system, we would be talking about all the blood vessels and the heart. Surface anatomy is where we pick a particular area, and all in that area we look at when determining a diagnosis. So if we're looking at the deltoid or the shoulder, we know we're talking about that region, that area. Microscopic anatomy is where we're talking about things we can't see with the naked eye, like the different tissue samples that you see at the bottom. And lastly is developmental anatomy. That is where we look at and analyze changes in the body from conception to full adult. So this is the levels of structural organization, a pyramid of stair steps, if you will. And it should look familiar to you because it is in basic biology. If we're talking about high school, we're talking about university. And what it does is the smallest level of structures of importance, and it goes up to the largest level or the greatest level. And you can also think of it as at the bottom, we're talking about less things involved. And the higher we go on this pyramid, it's where we're encompassing or including more. So at the very bottom is the chemical level. And that's where we're talking about atoms, we're talking about molecules, we're talking about elements, and that's chapter 2, which we'll talk about just a little bit more. When we go up a level, we're now putting the chemicals together, and we're now at the cellular level. We're at the stage where chemical reactions can occur in something as simple as a cell. Going up to the next level, when we put all the same cells together, we're going to make a tissue. So they look the same structurally and they function the same. Going up another level, when we put tissues together for a common purpose or a common function, we're now at the organ level. Going up another level, when organs work together for a common function, you're at the organ system level. For example, the urinary system, where we're talking about kidneys, ureters, bladder, urethra. That is an organ system. And then lastly, the very top is the most broad, if you will, structural level, and that's organismal level. Organismal level just means it includes everything below. So there's some necessary life functions. These must occur for survival. First is boundaries. There has to be a distinct separation between internal and external environments. So obviously most of you would say, yeah, the skin is a boundary, and it's true. It's the largest organ in the body. But we're also going to talk about, what about a cell membrane? Isn't that a clear boundary between the internal environment of that cell and the external environment surrounding that cell? And the answer is yes. The second thing is movement, and it's not just, me, if you were to see me giving a typical lecture, I like to walk the room. It's not just movement like that. What about the movement of blood? What about digestion? So it's all types of movement. The third is responsiveness, and that means you're having a stimulus response scenario. So if you step on a tack, a response would be to move your foot away from that painful tack. So your body has to have a response to stimuli, because usually a stimulus is something your body needs or wants or is trying to protect for survival. The fourth is digestion. You have to have the ability to ingest something, and that ingested material, like food, has to be able to be broken down, pulled out, put into circulation for use. Fifth is metabolism. Metabolism is the sum or the total of all chemical reactions in the body. Okay, 6 is excretion. All this good stuff you're putting into the body, some of it's not going to be utilized. Some things, when it is working, like the urinary system, like the liver, it is going to give off a waste product, and that waste product has to be removed. One way, of course, is through the urinary system. Another is digestion with feces. Another is even within sweat. The seventh thing is reproduction. You are supposed to have the capabilities of having two things, sperm and egg meet, fertilization occurs, and then you have gestational development of a fetus. And then lastly is growth, and it's not necessarily in stature as the image portrays, but it's also growth and development throughout the body. You should be, quote unquote, not as smart as a developing toddler. However, at your adult stage, you should have increased that capability. So there has to be growth in all areas, whether it's an organ, whether it's an organ system, etc. Here are the organ systems. Now we're going to go through all of those when we go through A&P 1 and 2, but you should be able, if I mention it, know the basics right now for your first exam. So skeleton is going to include all bones, all joints, ligaments, and cartilage. Muscles, all the muscles in the body, whether it is the skeletal muscle, which is what gets us to move, cardiac muscle, which is the heart, or smooth muscle like the bladder. Nervous system is going to include the brain, the spinal cord, and all the nerves that come off of it. The lymphatic system is going to include some lymphatic organs, some lymphatic vessels that's involved with immunity. Cardiovascular system I mentioned in a previous slide, heart, blood vessels. Respiratory system is going to include the lungs, the diaphragm, nasal cavity, larynx. Digestive system, all the organs you see, everything from oral cavity, tracing it down the esophagus, all the way through to the intestines and the rectum. Urinary system I mentioned in a previous slide, kidneys, ureter, bladder, urethra. Reproductive system, you know, the reproductive organs associated with males and females. And then the endocrine system is what releases hormones in the body. And again, like I said, we're going to talk about each one of these very much in depth in either one or two, or both actually. How do we maintain this internal environment? So not only is boundaries important to separate inner and outer portions, or internal and external portions, but we have to be able to maintain it no matter what's going on in the external environment. So we need to keep what's going on inside of us constant, like temperature, like pH. Your body doesn't like change. This seesaw here represents what your body is constantly doing. It's never going to be this horizontal perfect line. It's in constant motion, trying to get at that constant line. Think of it this way. Your body, when it has something wrong, tends to overcompensate to get it back into the area. And if you overstimulate the thing, then it's going to get too high. So if we were, I'm just going to do the best I can. Okay, so if something is low, it looks like this. What does your body do? Does the opposite to get it to work. What happens then? Well, it starts to look like this, but eventually it's going to look like this. And then it has to do the reverse. So it's that seesaw pattern. This maintaining the internal environment, no matter what's going on in the external world, is called homeostasis. Last thing I want to say, this is really, really important, and I'm going to talk about it through chapters both in A&P 1 and A&P 2, but this is essential that you understand it. The majority of homeostasis is maintained by negative feedback. Negative feedback is that seesaw. So for example, calcium is high in the body. Well, you can't have that. That's very dangerous, and of course you'll learn why later on. So if calcium's too high, your body immediately wants to take it out of the blood and store it somewhere else, so the levels in the blood go down. But what happens? That overcompensation, now instead of being perfect, it goes too low. So now what has got to happen? Well, your body is going to now pull that calcium where you stored it, which happens to be the bone, and then pull it out and put it into blood. Now what happens? That calcium level goes back up, and then it gets too high. That back and forth motion, that seesaw, is negative feedback. Remember that negative feedback is where you want to reduce or completely stop the stimulus. Reduce or completely stop the stimulus. Positive feedback is different. This is where you want to increase that stimulus until the result occurs. And I put the perfect one there. It's the best example of it is going to be childbirth. What happens when you're going into labor? Well, the pressure of that fetus onto your cervix causes a reaction from the brain releasing oxytocin. You don't have to know all this mumble jumble yet. But that oxytocin is what's going to give you contractions. What happens? They get stronger. They get more frequent. Well, that's positive feedback. It is causing this reaction until we deliver the fetus.